The year is 1220. The air above the Zarafshan River valley is thick with the acrid smoke of burning cedar and the copper tang of blood. Below, the jewel of Central Asia, the glorious city of Samarkand, lies broken. Just weeks prior, this metropolis was the beating heart of the Khwarezmian Empire, a hub of the Silk Road where merchants traded Chinese silk for Persian glass, where scholars debated astronomy under turquoise domes, and where the gardens were said to rival paradise itself. Now, the irrigation canals run red. The silence that has fallen over the city is not the peace of night, but the quiet of the grave. History is often written by the victors, and for centuries, the narrative of the Mongol conquests has been dominated by military tactics, the speed of the cavalry, and the sheer geographical scale of Genghis Khan's empire. We count the cities burn, we map the borders, we marvel at the logistics, but buried beneath the statistics of the dead and the maps of conquest lies a more intimate, terrifying reality that is often glossed over in general history books. It is the specific, systematic, and calculated fate of the civilians, particularly the women, who found themselves trapped within the walls of Samarkand when the horse lords arrived. To understand the sheer magnitude of the horror that unfolded in 1220, we must first understand what was lost. Samarkand was not merely a military outpost. It was a center of high culture, sophistication, and immense wealth. The women of Samarkand, particularly those of the elite classes, lived lives of extraordinary refinement. They were the wives and daughters of merchants, artisans, scholars, and generals. They were accustomed to a life of relative security, shielded by the massive fortifications of the citadel and the arrogance of heir ruler, Sultan Muhammad II. They wore silks embroidered with gold thread, perfumed their hair with musk and ambergris, and lived in a society that, while patriarchal, afforded them the protections of high Islamic civilization. But in the steppes to the east, a storm had been gathering. Genghis Khan had united the Mongol tribes and turned his gaze westward. The conflict began not with an invasion, but with a diplomatic insult. When the Sultan of the Khwarezmian Empire executed Genghis Khan's envoys, he did not just start a war, he signed the death warrant of his entire civilization. The Mongols did not view war as a game of chess. To them, resistance was an affront to the sky itself. When they rode west, they did not come just to conquer, they came to punish. The speed of the Mongol advance was terrifying. They moved faster than news could travel. By the time the citizens of Samarkand realized the danger was real, the horizon was already darkened by the dust of 100,000 hooves. The psychological terror was the first weapon to breach the walls. Refugees from the frontier city of Otrar brought stories that seemed impossible to believe, stories of warriors who drank the blood of their horses, who never tired, and who showed no mercy. When the siege began, Samarkand was defended by a garrison of over 100,000 men, including war elephants and elite cavalry. The citizens believed they could hold out for months, perhaps years. But the Mongols were masters of psychological warfare. They encircled the city, cutting off all hope of escape or reinforcement. The terror within the walls grew with every passing day. The women of the city, watching from the rooftops and the narrow windows of the harem, saw the fires of the Mongol camp encircling them like a tightening noose. They heard the rhythmic beating of the great war drums, a sound designed to induce panic and despair. The tragedy of Samarkand is that the city was not taken by storm in the traditional sense. It was undone by betrayal and fear. The Turkic mercenaries defending the city, thinking they could find kinship with the Mongols, opened the gates on the 5th day. They hoped for mercy. They received none. The Mongols slaughtered the defectors to a man, viewing traitors as untrustworthy even if they were useful. With the outer city breached, the citadel fell soon after. This is the moment where the history books usually turn the page to the next battle, but we must pause here. We must step into the smoke-filled streets of the conquered city. The looting began immediately, but it was not the chaotic frenzy of a riot. The Mongols were disciplined. The destruction of Samarkand was an administrative process. The population was ordered to gather in the plain outside the city walls. Imagine the scene, tens of thousands of people, clutching their children and their most precious heirlooms, stumbling out of the gates under the watchful eyes of the Mongol horsemen. They were told they would be counted. This was a lie, and yet, it was also a truth. They were being counted, but not for census records. They were being sorted like livestock. The men of military age were separate. First. Most were executed on the spot, their bodies left to pile up in the ditches. Others were kept as human shields for the next siege, a fate arguably worse than death. The artisans and craftsmen, the potters, the weavers, the smiths, were separated next. They were valuable commodities to be sent back to Mongolia to serve the Khan. And then, there were the women. What happened to the women of Samarkand was not merely incidental violence. It was a systemic redistribution of human beings. The Mongols viewed the population of a conquered city as part of the spoils of war, no different from the gold in the treasury or the grain in the storehouses. The sorting process was brutal and dehumanizing. The older women, those deemed too old for labor or pleasure, were often killed simply to remove the burden of feeding them. But for the young women, the girls, and the mothers of childbearing age, a different nightmare began. They were inspected. Mongol commanders would walk through the trembling ranks of the captives, selecting women based on their appearance, their health, and their perceived status. The most beautiful women, often the daughters of the nobility and the wealthy merchants, were reserved for the highest-ranking generals and the kinsmen of Genghis Khan. These women, who days before had been living in palaces, surrounded by servants, were now the personal property of men who had spent their lives in the saddle, men who despised the soft, sedentary life of the city dwellers. The cultural shock alone would have been shattering. These women were not just taken as concubines. They were trophies. Possessing a woman from the high court of the Khwarezmian Empire was a status symbol for a Mongol warrior. It proved his prowess. It showed that he had toppled a great civilization and taken its most protected treasures. The women were forced to accompany the army as it moved on. They were stripped of their silks and jewels, forced to dress in the rough wool and leather of the nomads, and made to ride or walk alongside the baggage train. For the vast majority of the women of Samarkand, those who were not selected by the elite, the fate was even more harrowing. They were distributed among the common soldiers. We must look unflinchingly at the mathematics of this horror. The Mongol army was vast. Thousands of soldiers required rewards for their loyalty and their violence. The women were that reward. Accounts from the period, written by Persian historians like Juvaini, who later served the Mongols, describe the wailing that rose from the plain outside Samarkand as families were torn apart. Mothers were ripped from their sons, sisters from their brothers. The social fabric of the city was shredded in a single afternoon. A woman might see her husband beheaded, her son dragged away to be a human shield, and her daughter taken by a different regiment, all within the span of an hour. The sexual violence inflicted upon the women of Samarkand was absolute. It was used as a weapon of terror and dominance. In the eyes of the Mongol war machine, impregnating the women of a conquered enemy was a way to biologically erase that enemy. It was the ultimate assert. Ion of power. The genetic legacy of this campaign is still visible in the DNA of the population of Central Asia today, a silent testament to the scale of the violation. But there is another layer to this tragedy that is often overlooked. It is the fate of the women who were not kept, but who were used. As the Mongols prepared to march on to the next city, they needed supplies, they needed labor. Women who were not selected as wives or concubines were often enslaved as camp followers. They were forced to cook, to clean, to tend to the horses, and to carry heavy loads. These were women who, in many cases, had never performed manual labor in their lives. The physical toll was immense. Many died of exhaustion, starvation, or exposure to the harsh elements of the steppe winter. We must also consider the psychological state of these captives. They were surrounded by the murderers of their families. They were forced to serve the very men who had burned their homes. They lived in a constant state of trauma, with no hope of rescue, for the Khwarezmian Empire had effectively ceased to exist. There was no army coming to save them. The world they knew had ended. There is a specific story Hat illustrates the depth of this humiliation, though it concerns the royal family of the Khwarezmian Empire, whose fate mirrored that of the women of Samarkand. When the Sultan's mother, Turkan Khatun, was captured, she and the other royal women were not just killed. They were shared out among the Mongol generals. But Genghis Khan devised a specific torment for them, When the royal women were said to follow the Mongol camp, they were made to sing. Specifically, they were ordered to sing dirges and laments for their lost empire during the Mongol victory feasts. Imagine the scene: the flickering firelight of the Mongol camp, the raucous laughter of the victors, drunk on fermented mare's milk and the wine of the conquered vineyards, and standing before them, the former queens and princess of Samarkand and the empire, weeping as they were forced to perform their grief for the entertainment of their captors. This was the true nature of the Mongol psychological warfare. It was not enough to kill the body, they sought to break the spirit completely. For the women of Samarkand, the arrival of the Mongols also meant a collision of two entirely different worldviews regarding the role of women. In the Islamic world of Samarkand, women's lives were private, domestic, and segregated. In the Mongol world, women played a crucial, active role. Mongol women rode horses, managed the herds, and even offered political advice. When the women of Samarkand were absorbed into the Mongol camps, they were thrust into a society that they did not understand, and which viewed their previous lives with contempt. The Mongols valued strength and utility. The refined, delicate beauty prized in Samarkand was seen by the Mongols as weakness. The captives had to adapt instantly, or die. As the Mongol army moved on from the ruins of Samarkand, they left behind a city that was a ghost of its former self. But the women who were taken carried the memory of the city with them. They became the unwilling vectors of culture. In the decades that followed, as the Mongol Empire settled and began to administer its vast territories, these captive women raised children who were half Mongol and half Persian or Turkic. They whispered stories of the old days, of the blue tiles of Samarkand, of the poetry and the prayers. It is a strange irony of history that the Mongols, who destroyed the Islamic Golden Age in Central Asia, eventually became the patrons of a new Persianate culture. And who was responsible for civilizing the conquerors? In large part, it was the women. The women of Samarkand, and cities like it, who were taken into the households of the khans and the generals, slowly, over generations, reintroduced the culture of the cities they had lost. They taught their children the languages of the West, the etiquette of the court, and the faith of Islam. But that cultural assimilation was centuries away. In 1220, there was only the shock, the sheer scale of the enslavement of Samarkand's women sent a tremor of fear across the known world. As refugees fled west into Persia and the Arab lands, and east towards China, they brought with them the tales of what had happened. They spoke of how the women of Samarkand, the pearls of the East, were now walking barefoot in the dust behind the Mongol horses. This fear changed the behavior of other cities. In the years following the fall of Samarkand, we see instances where men in other besieged cities would kill their own wives and daughters rather than let them fall into Mongol hands. This is the ultimate measure of the horror that the Mongols inspired. The fate of the women of Samarkand was considered a destiny so terrible that death was seen as a mercy. We must also address the fate of those who were left behind in ruins. Not everyone was killed or marched away. Some hid in the cellars, in the dry wells, in the intricate sewage systems of the city. When they emerged, days later, they found a wasteland. The women who survived the initial sack found themselves in a city without men. The social structure had been decapitated. These survivors had to scavenge for food in the smoldering wreckage. They had to bury the dead, a task usually reserved for men, to prevent plague. They had to rebuild from nothing. The genetic and cultural scar left on Samarkand was permanent. The city eventually rose again under the Timurid centuries later to become a new capital of splendor. But the Samarkand of 1219, the ancient city of the Khwarezmian Shahs, was gone forever. The lineage of its people had been irrevocable. Why altered? When we look back at the year 1220, it is easy to be seduced by the military genius of Genghis Khan. It is easy to look at the maps and see the arrows moving west. But as we close this chapter of history, we must force ourselves to look away from the generals and the maps. We must focus on the human cost. The shock of what happened in Samarkand is not just in the violence, it is in the transformation. It is the story of how a human being, a woman with a name, a family, and a history, is transformed by the machinery of war into a unit of currency, a prize, or a disposable object. The women of Samarkand were the guardians of their culture's future, the mothers of the next generation. By targeting seizing them and redistributing them, the Mongols did not just conquer a city, they hijacked the future. They took the biological and cultural capital of the Khwarezmian Empire and absorbed it into their own. So, when you walk through the museums of Central Asia today, or read the epics of the Mongol Empire, remember the silence of the Zarafshan Valley in the spring of 1220. Remember that the greatness of the Mongol Empire was built not just on the backs of horses, but on the broken lives of the people they conquered. The shock is not that it happened. The shock is that, for the women of Samarkand, the end of the world was not a metaphor. It was a Tuesday in March, when the gates opened and the sky turned black with smoke. It is a reminder that civilization is fragile, that safety is an illusion, and that the line between a golden age and a dark age is often nothing more than the whim of a conqueror on the horizon. This is the legacy of Samarkand. It is a testament to resilience, yes, but prim. Airily, it is a monument to the terrifying vulnerability of the innocent when the wheels of history begin to turn. The women of Samarkand were not soldiers, yet they bore the heaviest burden of the war. Their story deserves to be told, not as a footnote to Genghis Khan's glory, but as the central tragedy of an empire's fall. As the dust settled over the Silk Road, the world had changed. The East bleeding into the West, and the blood that greased the wheels of this great change belonged, in large part,